Now, the agents of these money changers go on to be people's presidents, prime ministers, heads of state of some varying shape and degree, heads of major corporations. So, one such sinister character, the Prime Minister, John Key, you happen to have a bit of info on him. What do you know about John Key?
I know a lot about John Key, and you're the first person of any. I have sent this information that I'm about to divulge to you to most media outlets in this country, to many so-called public service representatives. This information I'm about to disclose to you is from his own mouth, from some of his compatriots that he used to work with in the financial services sector, and the admissions of what he got up to from the highest levels of such as Bill Clinton himself. Well, John Key he runs around claiming that, as though he blames everything that is why he can't alleviate our financial concerns in this country on the global financial crisis, and he claims that he's very much tries to put distance between what happened and occurred when he was in those money markets or investment banking markets. But he was actually, I allege, and believe I have irrefutable proof of from his own mouth, that he was as big a part as anybody in the actual global financial crisis, such as recent as 2005, he did an article with Fran O'Sullivan in the New Zealand Herald, published on July the 20th of 2005. And just to summarise, I'll read some of that article out. It says, this is John Key. Why not have an offshore banking industry based here, he asks. In the right conditions, you could attract 200 banks to register here, each with a CEO and staff. You could attract insurance companies, bring back lots of Kiwi accountants and lawyers, single out clusters such as high-class yachts on other special sectors as the Irish did. Key is clearly on a roll as he lists the options that New Zealand could explore if it decided to abandon outdated ideology and take a more pragmatic approach to growing the economy. The former investment banker knows what he's talking about. As the head of global foreign exchange for investment giant Merrill Lynch, he shifted a considerable amount of his business to Ireland in the mid-1990s to take advantage of a 10% tax rate for foreign investors. The investment was a runaway success. We transferred across the aircraft leasing business, the complex interest rates, derivative business, the entire back office for global foreign exchange, and a huge chunk of private clients business, says Key. The example of how the Irish transformed their economy into one of Europe's preeminent investment destinations and lifted their per capita GDP has stayed in Key's mind. But as a former money man, he is also interested in how Jersey built its economy on the back of offshore trusts. And just to continue, from John Key's National Party website bio itself, he proudly states his past employment record in banking. John launched his investment banking career in New Zealand in the mid-80s. After 10 years in the New Zealand market, he headed offshore, working in Singapore, London and Sydney for US investment banking giant Merrill Lynch. During that time, he was in charge of a number of business units, including global foreign exchange and European bond and derivatives trading. In 1999, John was invited to join the Foreign Exchange Committee of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and on 2 occasions undertook management studies at Harvard University. Of course, the relevance is this period of between 1999 and 2001, when he was on the advisory board of the US Federal Reserve, was at a time when substantial amounts of financial deregulation occurred, like the breaking down of the Glass-Steagall Act, which kept the private investment banks that basically have access to what I refer to as the magic checkbook, that can create money out of fresh air and lend it to people at interest or buy into the real economy. There used to be a check and balance to actually keep those guys so that they'd just actually make money from the creation of money out of nothing, but they realised if you let anybody loose in the real economy with a checkbook that you don't have to earn anything on and buy what you want and lend to people at interest, you're going to eventually monopolise everything. So those laws were broken down in 1999. And there were laws passed by the Clinton administration surrounding the areas of derivatives. Now, derivatives as I've explained before, due to what is now the highly recognised and not even contested at the highest levels, what they're referring to as the money floor, the fact that, especially since the implementation of electronic credit, 98% of the money supply now originates as loans to private lending institutions. I'll try not to mention it again in the program, Vinny, but there is a systemic shortage of principal plus interest owed to the private lending institutions that eventually enslaves us by mathematical formula. So these derivatives, so the banking system itself at the very fundamental level is insolvent by design. When it became that, they went absolutely mad and issued more created credit than some of their own lobbyists. I've read reports. They report that they've issued excess created credit to the ability of 8 times the world's current resources to support things like this. So these derivatives, when the system became quite clearly had run up against what a guy called John Fullerton, the chief executive of JP Morgan, says has run up against the fiscal system has run up against the boundaries of the biosphere. They came up with all of these derivatives, which were basically insurances to make people keep confidence in the confidence trick that the banking system was solvent. They came up with a whole heap of insurances. Basically, so you could insure your losses. They claim you could insure and then these insurance policies went on to become the new investment vehicles that afflicted the world. John Key was the head of the European bond and derivatives trading. He claimed he wasn't directly responsible for these products, but he oversaw those that were. So he's complicit as anybody, if you ask me. So they basically filled Ireland with a boatload of in excess of created credit, the financial service sector, after being offered all sorts of sweetheart deals. They transferred as much as they could into their own personal trust accounts. Then they fled with that personal wealth. John Key is worth an estimated $60 million today. I would allege that much of it came from those
Hold on a second. Didn't John Key, when he first came into office, put a whole heck of his money and assets and everything into a quote-unquote blind trust? Is that the trust you might be talking about that they swindled out of Ireland?
Yeah, those so-called blind trusts that he has no oversight in. That's a whole new topic, but it's been quite clearly observed that he, of course, can see what's in those trusts, and no one's going to give $60 million aside and leave it up to somebody to run, are you really? But
hold on a second. This is the naivety of the media. Our Prime Minister has put $60 million of his wealth into a blind thingy that he can't control in order to stop him from doing any nasty business while he's in Parliament with all that stuff that he owns. Yeah,
it's a joke. So John Key was that good at creating or overseeing the creation of a means for the financial service sector to bring into creation more created credit than the real economy could support, that he got invited onto what is essentially the back office for the private central banking network. That's the New York branches of the U.S. Federal Reserve. He's at a time when the deregulation was passed to allow these bankers to go crazy with their excess created credit and their derivatives and their bogus products that actually brought the global financial system down by the time it came around in 2008. He claims he always tries to distance himself from being in that industry at a period that had anything to do with the current global financial crisis. But in fact, as I've hopefully proved to you here from his own mouth, that he was a major part of it. Now, he was that good at creating the merry money go around. He was invited, one of the few outsiders invited onto the advisory board of the US Federal Reserve itself at a time when all this deregulation was passed. Now, in a recent interview with ABC or PBS, I think it was, in the US, in April of last year, Bill Clinton himself, in an interview with Evan Harris, and I'll read some of it actually, and it pretty much. So not only John Key admits himself quite proudly at times that he was part of this industry and what he did, depending on what circles and who he's talking to, of course. But And then this is how Bill Clinton summed up his admission that he was wrong in deregulating the financial derivatives industry. In my exclusive interview, I asked former President Bill Clinton if he thought he got bad advice on regulating complex financial instruments known as derivatives from his former Treasury Secretaries, Robert Rubin and Larry Summers. He acknowledged that he was wrong to take advice on those advising him against regulating derivatives. On derivatives, I think they were wrong, and I think I was wrong to take their advice, because the argument on derivatives was that these things are expensive and sophisticated, and only a handful of investors will buy them, and they don't need any extra protection and any extra transparency. The money they're putting up guarantees them transparency, Clinton told me. And the flaw in the argument, Clinton added, was that first of all, sometimes people with a lot of money make stupid decisions and make it without transparency. The former president also said he was also wrong about understanding the consequences if the derivatives market tanked. The former president also said he was also wrong about understanding the consequences if the derivatives market tanked. The most important flaw was even if less than 1% of the total investment community is involved with derivative exchanges, so much money was involved that if they went bad, they could affect 100% of investments, and indeed 100% of the citizens in countries, not investors, and I was wrong about that. So that is from Bill Clinton himself as to his own assumptions now, only one odd year ago, as to what role derivatives played in the global financial crisis at the very time that John Key was right in amongst it, overseeing it. So it makes a mockery of his claims that he runs around over here. And so then you add to the fact that up until 2005, as recent as 2005, he was singing the praises of the Irish economy that they'd created, wanting us to be just the same. And since the collapse, he's been running around stating that we now no longer want to be like Ireland. But I can show you, Vinny, that although running around claiming we don't want to be like Ireland, and actually I'll give you an idea from Simon Johnson, the former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, up until 2008, how he described the Irish economy. In an article in Irish Central magazine of May 23, 2010, he said this: Ireland's politicians, rather than facing up to their problems, are making things ever worse. Simply put, the Irish miracle was a mirage driven by clever use of tax haven rules and a huge credit boom that permitted real estate prices and construction to grow quickly before declining ever more rapidly. As regards to John Key now claiming that we now don't want to be like Ireland, but I'll read out a list of regulations that this government have put in place since I've been in power, Vinny, and I would allege that it's hard to conclude that, what he's stating publicly certainly isn't what he's doing in the back office. They're setting us up to be just like Ireland, and I believe with the intentions of the same so-called financial service sector buddies profiting just as they did there. As soon as they got into power, they removed the Reserve Bank policy target and the employment from the Reserve Bank policy target agreement. Now, if they're serious about employment, this Reserve Bank policy target agreement is what prioritises the private bank credit when it comes into circulation. Actually gives it priority as to what it should do for society. So, the Labor Party have always included employment in that policy target agreement. As soon as National got into power, they took it out. They're in the process of hammering through the House a zero tax for foreign financial institutions moving their money here, money earned offshore, to move it here. Pay no tax on it. John Key claims that we will make the money from when they move their back offices here and basically become a financial hub for the financial services sector in the Pacific region. When they did this in every other place it's been tried, is you sweet out corporate tax deals to these so-called financial service sector types to move their money here. Once the creative accountancy and so forth are done, every nation they've gone to, they've ended up claiming rebates. They don't pay tax, mate, as you and I know, Vinny. That's what hollowed and gutted Ireland, part of the process. We've put in place here they passed an exemption to the local lending laws to give and set up this local lending authority that now gives the tax rating bases of all the councils are seen as one now as collateral for loans, and they can now borrow from what they call the wholesale money markets or the primary bond dealers under the same operations that our national government does, with exemptions of disclosure to who they borrow this money from. Local councils used to have to get two signatures. The entire council used to have to sign off on loans. They now have to only get 2 signatures, and the whole deal is not privy to the Official Information Act. And this is for, we currently owe our national debt again and repayments. We're in debt repayment crisis again, territory for sure. So that's why we're looking at selling. Once again, this banker's mathematical interest trap has rolled over top of us, as it has since we were put into receivership for the first time in 1961. And that was when we started selling it. We handed over our gold reserves then for further funding from the International Monetary Fund. I would put it to you that we've been under conditions of like statutory management, because the IMF is like the receivership branch of the private central banking network. When their mathematical trap rolls over you, they put the receivers in to supposedly say, it's all your fault, you guys stuffed up, you can't run your economy, we must run it for you. But Joseph Stiglitz, the former vice president of the World Bank and Nobel laureate, actually knows the workings of the IMF and has stated that they're a hospital that makes you sicker. They actually come in, instead of to trade you out of trouble, they represent the Wall Street banks to trade you further into trouble, to force you to sell more of your assets to the banks.
In other words, their business practice is not partnership. Their business practice is hostile takeover. An
ex-financial balance of payment analyst for Chase Manhattan, a guy called Michael Hudson, clearly he states it as financial. It is a financial invasion. He talks in terms of this is financial warfare. So these are the guys at these levels, at the highest levels of banking. These are the terms they're using these days, and we wouldn't know it in this country with the current media we have. So John Key is putting in place regulation exactly, apart from stating that we don't want to end up like Ireland, step by step he's putting in exactly the same regulation under exactly the same predatory banking lending practices that allow them to do what they did in Ireland. And so, but we've been selling assets, apart from the last decade, at least Helen Clark's social engineering government had enough sense to know that you don't sell assets, mate, because, once you're in a hole over your head, if you sell your ladder, you're never going to get out, are you? So at least you had enough sense. But up until that period, from 1961 until 1999, we'd been selling assets in this country for 30 years, and yet our national debt was told that was to alleviate our debt repayment crisis situation, and yet our national debt has still exponentially increased over that period, yet we've been selling away.
That happened for the last 30 years to get us out of debt, and it didn't work. And so now they're saying we need to do it again to get us out of debt.
Yes, they are, mate.
Oh my God, people are so stupid. How can they just be so blind? It's like they don't have any memory.
Exactly. Gough can't be accused of not having what they call institutional memory, because he was part of the Roger Douglas government that during the receivership of the 80s, because that's what it was. It's receivership at the hands of the international private lending institutions. And but at least in Gough's defence, he has recently came out and made heartfelt apologies, and at least says, hey, we stuffed up big time by selling assets, and I now realise that, you know what I mean? But this man, Mr. Key, is a different kettle of fish. When he strolls across the road there to the Treasury and the New Zealand Debt Management Office and so forth, he walks in there with a full knowledge of exactly what's going on and what the outcomes are. When Phil Gough goes across there, or I would say he doesn't go across there for fear of ridicule, because he doesn't know what the hell goes on there. That's why it's quite funny. You go down there and you realise just the physical locations of these buildings are only 300 metres apart, and yet 95% of the people in amongst our so-called public representatives in that parliament don't even know what happens 300 metres away in those buildings there that are ripping us blind.
It's kind of like a drug dealer lives down the street from you. You just never noticed until one day the SWAT team comes in.
Yeah. No, it is. They've got a tinny house. They've got a tinny house operating across the road, and everybody just strolls past every day and turns a complete blind eye to it.
The Beehive is a tinny house. Okay, I love it.
No, the tinny house is across the road from the Beehive in that New Zealand Debt Management and Treasury Office, because that's at number one on the terrace, and our Reserve Bank and the cabinet, the office of the Prime Minister and Cabinet's advisors is across the road at number 2. And then straight across the road, some 200 metres away, is the Beehive.
And for those of you who are unaware of the New Zealand nomenclature, a tinny house in New Zealand, when you buy marijuana, it is wrapped in tin foil, which has become colloquially known as a tinny. And a tinny house is a place usually run by a gang where you run up to the front door, put money through a slot in the front of it, and then they pass you some marijuana wrapped in foil. Hence, the tinny house. And it's not entirely different, because after all, once it comes through the slot, you have no idea what they've actually given you. You have no idea what's been added to it. And also, incidentally, you don't know precisely how much they've given you. And, more to the point, you can't go back and complain, because they'll then hit you over the head with a 2x4. So it's a perfect analogy for the debt management of New Zealand and how it really works. It's a freaking tinny house down the shop.
Exactly. When most of our other politicians, well, they don't go near that financial precinct because of their lack of knowledge and fear of being shown up. But like Mr. Key, when he goes over there, he knows exactly what's going on over there, what the outcomes are going to be, and for whom he's working for. And it's actually quite disgusting. And a lot of people have asked me, well, like I say, that information I disclosed to you, Vinny, I have sent to most every mainstream media outlet in this country. I've spouted it off on many blogs such as bernardhickeysinterest.co.nz, and I get it. You know, I put these documents together. It takes a lot of time and effort, and you think, well, you know, we've got a winner here. We're going to wake some people up, but hell, that old saying of leading the horse to water and trying to make it drink is just rings true to me. And it's so frustrating.
Unless, of course, you've got a gun to the horse's head, because as we
or a debt gun, yeah.
Yeah, but, well, that's basically what it is. We're just in the middle of an economic execution ceremony.
Yeah, and the people have asked me, well, and I know that I actually do know that a number of people in the upper echelons of the Labour Party that I've sent this information to have read it, and why they do not attack. The only reason I can come up with as to why because this would destroy John. If it goes mainstream, it would destroy. I would hope you would recognise from what I've just supplied, would destroy John Key's credibility as to whose interests he works in this country, whether it be the public interest or his old banking frat buddies, within minutes. But the thing is, at the highest, it was what I call a diplomatic gag. At the highest level of politics, if they were to attack John Key on this, there are now many people that he used to work with and were involved with that are in high levels of administrations throughout the world, mainly the American administration. And you would, by attacking him and bringing those guys into disrepute, you would cause what I term a diplomatic incident by insulting another government. And that's the only reason I think, like Phil Goff being... he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, would be far more susceptible to that gag than anybody. And my interpretation of watching the debates so far at the leadership level is Key sounded him out to see how far Phil Goff might step out of the current economic box. And once he's realised that he's not going to, he's just hammered him. And that's my observations.
If you've got an inherently corrupt system, it is actually in a person's best interest to therefore act corrupt.
Yep. Well, I think it's becoming more obvious to the average man on the street. I think a lot of people out there are beginning to sense that things aren't adding up, such as the Occupy movement is bringing to light, you know. But they sense that something's not adding up, something's wrong, but a lot of people can't prove it, of course. And those that are meant to protect the public interest, such as the fourth estate, known as the media, are meant to be investigative and make sure that there's balanced opinions put out on both sides of things. Our public representatives, most of our public representatives are just career politicians. They're more worried about keeping their snout in the trough and getting next week's paycheck rather than the public interest. They just learn that if you can overcome what most people's fear is of public speaking and get the gift of the gab, it's access to a reasonable living. But, and then they get in there and leave the running of the country up to a bureaucracy. And if you study that bureaucracy, mate, it is just chocker full of, you go back through the work history of the people, the main elements of our bureaucracy, chocker full of ex-banking sector employees. They've infiltrated most everything that has attempted to be done in the public interest. These guys have infiltrated and headed off and managed to round up, including the hiring and firing processes within our government, is absolutely disgusting. When we got put into receivership in 1984 to continue to have our debt refinanced by the private central banking network, we had to surrender to a boatload of legislation that they handed us. And basically, it goes right down to the process of the hiring and firing within our government. We have a Minister of State Services and a Commissioner of State Services is just about where the rubber hits the road as to whether it's supposed to be a separation of powers where our minister keeps an eye on the Commissioner of State Services to make sure either one doesn't get up to basically tyranny or corruption. The Commissioner of State Services has the right to appoint the chief executives of all of our ministerial departments. Basically, our state services, the Minister of State Services, only rubber stamps. It's essentially a rubber stamping process of the Commissioner on the private side of our public service. So he goes out and gets these recruitment agencies such as Hudson's Global Resources and Manpower and the likes. And when you study the ownership of them, they're owned by the private central banking network. So we pay $27,000 a pop for these recruitment agencies to go out around the world to recruit bankers to come in to be the chief executives of most of our ministerial departments. And then once it is in the statute books that once, and then those chief executives become the hirers of everybody below them, independent of the government. And this is fact, Vinny, and I can show you the documents. It's just...
So you're saying that international banksters are the Viet Cong of the New Zealand public?
A lot of people try and put a conspiracy angle on it. It is actually quite simple, that simple. A lot of people were down there in the weekend trying to prove who was private owners of this building and that building. If you're the private owners of our legislation, you own the country and run the country to your own interest. And that's essentially how to the level it goes. They control the hiring and firing at most every step of our so-called public service. I can prove to you that they come in, the IMF send auditors of our higher learning education facilities, institutions, universities and the like. They come out every 6 months to make sure that we are continuing to teach so-called world's best practice, which happens to be their practice. They control the media around the world. There's something like 5 major corporations now own 95% of the world's media. It's so concentrated, the editing of it. And you study the ownership of it, and they're the tier 1 level investment banks. The banks, as that Swiss study showed recently, own 80% of the liquidity basically in the entire world's real economy at present. And so they, and this is repeated around the world, is every time you get into debt to them, they come in, basically put you into statutory management, such as that letter that was recently leaked that the IMF, the European Central Bank, gave to the Italian government, saying that they will not, because they like us, we have to go across the road down there. Our Reserve Bank goes across the road to the private debt management office that's across the road, has to go across there every 90 days and find refinancing for debt equivalent to 90% of our entire GDP. So we have to go cap in hand to them regularly. And so basically you do as they say, or they'll switch that tap off. They decide whether you prosper or whether you go into recession or depression.
Some people think that politicians are perfectly fine. They're all just having a good time, and they're not. There's nothing sinister going behind the scenes and what have you. They can say what they want, and everything's all good. And it's like, well, if politicians can say what they want, ask JFK.